Hello, everyone. I'd like to continue telling you about how to orchestrate a romantic symphony. Why? Well, maybe you want to learn how to compose music, or maybe you just love music and want to understand it better. In the first video of this series on the Romantic Symphony, I sketched out a first movement for you, and in the subsequent videos I've been showing you the orchestration. Today I'd like to focus on one part of the movement, which includes the statement of the second theme, followed by what's called the closing theme. The closing theme ends the first chunk of the movement, the exposition, where the themes are introduced. That whole segment, the second theme and closing theme together, covers about 40 measures, which is about a minute and a half of music. That's our subject for today. Here you see the second theme introduced in the cellos. You see it repeated here in the violins, and later you'll see the music move on to a loud, triumphant closing theme with heavy brass and drums. There are some really nice sounds in here, and in particular there are some very common orchestral techniques, part of the standard toolkit. Let's start with the tune in the cellos. The cellos are a favorite instrument for lovely, lyrical tunes. They have a quality almost like a human voice, a rich, expressive tenor voice. For example, in Beethoven's Ninth, the famous tune is introduced first in the cellos. I may have done myself a disservice by reminding you of the greatest music in the world right before we listen to my little tune, but let's listen to it anyway. It's light, cheerful, lyrical, and it doesn't need a complicated or heavy accompaniment. I've given it simple chords bopping in the background. And this is another example of a standard tool in the toolkit. Speaking of Beethoven, this part reminds me of Beethoven's Eighth Symphony in the second movement. It's a very simple, very bright sound, constructed by using the full woodwind ensemble plus the horns. Let's look in a little more detail. I've chosen to use oboes in thirds, and the flutes doubling the oboes an octave higher. That combo, oboes and flutes, always gives a nice bright sound. Here the oboes and clarinets are interlocked. The bottom note of the oboes is doubled by the upper note of the clarinets. That interlocking helps blend and balance the sound. And you see the bassoons and horns doubling each other, bringing up the bottom. There's a moment, by the way, where I want a little more intensity to the sound. The melody has a little swell in it right here, and to beef up the background chords in that moment, I added the violas in thirds. They're doubling the oboes, but an octave lower. Let's listen to the woodwinds and horns. Together with the strings, it sounds like this. Now let's center the score on the next segment. The melody repeats, but a simple repeat is too static. The music should always be changing. The first statement of the theme was simple, modest, and the second statement should be more elaborated. In this case, I think it's a little more cheeky, a little more fun, with added flourishes. The tune is now carried by the violins and doubled by the flutes an octave higher. As for the accompaniment, notice that the horns and the oboes are doing the same thing as before, bopping out those background chords. But for the rest, I've arpeggiated the background to make it sound a little more complex and dancey. Here's a good example of just simply straight up doubling the instruments to make the sound stronger. The bassoons are doubling the cellos to give a little more oomph to that bass line so it doesn't fade on you. The clarinets are doubling the violas, and of course the flutes are doubling the first violins. So here's a passage that does exactly what I told you not to do in the last video. Why put it in here? Because there are circumstances where this straight-up doubling is useful, and I want to show you that. If you want the separate components to stand out, you might want to intensify them by doubling the strings with the woodwinds. Let's hear that accompaniment. The oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, violas, and cellos, everything except the tune itself. It's still pretty light and charming. Before we listen to the whole segment together, I should point out one more added bit of charm, the second violins. They show up here and there in a little bit of a counter melody to the main tune. It's almost like a little bit of humor. As you listen to this whole segment, I want you to think about the added complexities, the bells and whistles, the little flashy doohickeys added on to make the second statement of the theme more interesting. And think about how easy it was to do that. With an orchestra, you have so many variables to play with that you can take the same tune and make it sound fresh. Now let's listen to that second presentation of the theme. I'm going to skip a few measures. Don't worry, I'll play the whole passage at the end of this video, but right now I want to skip to the closing theme and show you another standard piece of orchestration. This is the full orchestra sound. When people think about a symphony, this is the sound they usually imagine. Every instrument playing all at once, in what's called a tutti. There's a few things I want you to notice. First, notice how rare it is. We've been through 3 minutes of music already, and now we get a few seconds of full orchestra. You don't need this big sound all over the place. It's meant for key moments. Second, students often think this must be the hardest part of orchestration because you have all these instruments to handle, but actually it's the easiest part. It's highly constrained, in a way even formulaic. The hard part is when you have only a few instruments at a time, and you have to decide which ones to use, and how to weave in new instrument sounds while fading out the previous ones. But having everything play a big loud chord is easy. Let's just concentrate on these few measures. The strings have a very simple tune on top and simple chords underneath. They sound like this. The woodwinds are essentially doubling the strings. Again, we have flutes and oboes doubling each other an octave apart. And the clarinets and bassoons fill out the lower part of the chord. Together, the woodwinds sound like this. And finally, we have the brass and drums to give it that crashing, powerful sound. Here you see the horns and trumpets doubling each other, which is one of the big power sounds in the orchestra. They turn into a single full-throated stentorian instrument. They're just hitting simple harmony notes like sledgehammers. And we have all three trombones and the timpani pounding away on the dominant and tonic. F, B flat, F, B flat. The brass and drums sound like this. put all the orchestral forces together, and it sounds like this. There are a lot of details I didn't talk about yet, like the double stop here and the triple stop here. This one's possible only because the D is an open string. It doesn't require the fingerboard, so the player can essentially swipe over the D and then do a double stop on these upper notes. It tends to give a very punchy sound. And you might wonder, why leave out the heavy brass here? It's because I want this moment to be the climax. And there are many other details that I could talk about, but rather than point out every little detail, let's go back to the start of this whole passage that I've talked about today, and we'll listen to the full orchestration.